It looked like nothing else in the sky, if you were lucky enough to even catch a glimpse of it. 2 engines, nose to tail, one pulling and one pushing, working together to generate enough force to shoot the machine at speeds of 470 miles per hour. Faster than the world airspeed record, even with weapons, fuel, and armor. Any Allied fighter that dared go after it would already be too late. So fast, in fact, that not even the German Air Ministry could keep up. Ever since World War I, Claude Dornier had been thinking about tandem engines. 2 power plants lined up nose to tail along the center line of an aircraft, one pulling, one pushing. He had used the arrangement on his giant flying boats of the 1920s and 30s, including the DO-X, at the time the largest aircraft ever built. But those were lumbering giants designed to carry passengers across oceans. What Dornier had begun to suspect, and what he would spend years trying to convince others of, was that the same principle, applied to a combat aircraft, could produce something genuinely extraordinary. Dornier had seen that with 2 engines in the conventional position, slung under the wings, you gain power, but pay a steep price in drag and handling. A twin-engine aircraft with a failed engine doesn't just slow down, it tries to corkscrew into the ground, demanding constant, exhausting correction from the pilot. Yet by mounting both engines along the center line instead, the drag problem largely disappears. So does the asymmetric thrust. The engine flies as cleanly as a single-engine design, but with twice the power. In 1937, Dornier filed a patent for exactly this configuration applied to a combat aircraft. 2 years later, he turned it into a serious design proposal, the P-59, a high-speed bomber expected to exceed 480 miles per hour at a time when most frontline fighters struggled past 350. To prove the concept was more than mere fantasy, he commissioned a small test aircraft, the Göppingen G-69, a stripped-down, scaled model with a single engine driving a pusher propeller through an extension shaft behind the tail. However, at the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, or RLM, Germany's Air Ministry, skepticism abounded. Surely this long shaft would vibrate itself to pieces. There was only one way to find out. In early 1940, test pilot Ivan Quenzler towed the little aircraft aloft behind a Dornier 17, cut loose, and fired up the engine. It worked. The shaft held. Dornier went back to the RLM in Berlin, proudly brandishing his results. But the answer was no. Germany in 1940 was a nation intoxicated by its own success. Poland had fallen in weeks. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France would soon follow. Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe and overseeing the 4-year economic plan, had little patience for ambitious projects that couldn't be ready quickly. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Junkers Ju-88, the Henkel HE-111, these were the weapons that were winning the war. Why pour resources into something radical and untested when victory already seemed inevitable? Göring ordered the cancellation of any project that wouldn't reach completion by early 1941. The P-59 was shelved. For Dornier, it was a blow, but he refused to be disheartened. He kept working anyway, quietly refining the design on his own account. Because unlike Göring, he could see further than the next 12 months, and he suspected the war was going to last a great deal longer than anyone in Berlin wanted to admit. Dornier was right. By 1942, the easy victories were over. The Luftwaffe that had so efficiently swept through Poland, France, and the Low Countries was now bleeding. The Battle of Britain had been lost. The invasion of the Soviet Union, meant to be finished in weeks, had ground into a catastrophic winter stalemate. German fighter pilots, who'd once accumulated victories at a staggering pace against hopelessly outclassed opponents, were finding the skies increasingly hostile and increasingly crowded with enemies who could actually fight back. And then there was the Mosquito. The de Havilland Mosquito, a twin-engine British aircraft built largely from wood, had entered RAF service in late 1941 and had rapidly become the Luftwaffe's most humiliating problem. Fast, agile, and capable of flying at altitudes and speeds that most German fighters couldn't match, it ranged freely over occupied Europe. As a bomber, it carried no defensive guns. It simply didn't need them. It could outrun whatever came after it. As a night fighter, it was lethal. As a reconnaissance aircraft, it was almost untouchable. Germany had no answer for it. The gap in performance that Dornier had warned about was now painfully visible to everyone. The Bf-110 heavy fighter, once considered a fearsome weapon, had been so thoroughly outclassed that Allied pilots were now calling it meat on the table. The development pipeline that Goering had strangled with his short-term thinking had left the Luftwaffe with almost nothing coming to replace it. So in late 1942, the RLM swallowed its pride and issued a requirement for a new high-speed aircraft. A single-seat, fast bomber and intruder capable of rivaling the Mosquito. 5 companies were invited to submit proposals: Arado, Junkers, Henkel, Messerschmitt, and Dornier. Of course, Claude Dornier had a head start. He'd already been working on exactly this aircraft for 3 years. His submission, the P-231, was essentially the P-59 idea, refined and updated, built around a pair of powerful Daimler-Benz DB603 engines. It promised performance that the other proposals couldn't match. The Air Ministry's evaluation agreed, and the P-231 was declared the winner. After years of closed doors and canceled contracts, Dornier finally had his chance. On October 6, 1943, the first prototype rolled out of Dornier's factory at Monsel. By now, the aircraft had been given the official designation DO-335, along with the name Pfeil, the German word for arrow. It was certainly an unsettling machine to look at. Enormous by fighter standards, tall enough to walk under without ducking, long as a medium bomber, with that rear propeller sitting behind the cruciform tail, like something from an engineering fever dream. The aircraft silhouette was so alien that the Luftwaffe's own anti-aircraft units would later need a special recognition bulletin to stop their own gunners from shooting it down. By October 26th, it was ready for its maiden flight. At the controls was Hans Dieterle, one of Germany's most experienced test pilots, a man who, in 1939, had set the world airspeed record in a Henkel HE-100 V8 prototype. If anyone could handle an untested machine with a novel engine arrangement, it was him. The flight was brief, cut short by a locking issue with the landing gear, a minor technical problem that could be easily fixed. But in terms of the DO-335's flying capabilities, Dieterle had seen enough to give an unambiguous evaluation. The aircraft had no unpleasant characteristics. Single-engine handling, always the nightmare scenario for twin-engine fighters, was much better than the usual arrangement. The rear propeller, the component that had made the RLM so nervous, caused no problems whatsoever. What he couldn't fully report yet, because the landing gear problem had curtailed the flight before full performance testing, was just how fast it was. But in subsequent tests, that would quickly become clear. In level flight, the DO-335 reached speeds that put it in a different category from almost anything flying at the time. At altitude, it could sustain over 470 miles per hour. The official world airspeed record, set by a Messerschmitt Me-209 in 1939, stood at 469 miles per hour. The DO-335 could exceed that in operational trim, carrying weapons, fuel, and armor, at a time when the average Allied piston-engine fighter was struggling to reach 400. As more prototypes flew and more pilots strapped in, the reports were consistent. Hans-Werner Lersch, a test pilot at the Luftwaffe's research center in Rechlin, would later describe it as, quote, an unusually powerful aircraft with exceptional flying qualities. He added that it gave him, quote, the pure pleasure of flying, a feeling which I shall not forget as long as I live. For an aircraft of its size, it was also surprisingly agile. In simulated dogfights, it could hold its own against the Focke-Wulf FW-190, one of the Luftwaffe's finest fighters. And if a pilot ever found himself in trouble, he had a simple solution: push the throttles forward and leave his opponent behind. No piston-engine aircraft could catch it. The DO-335 seemed to exceed every expectation. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, one of the Luftwaffe's most senior figures and a firm supporter of the program, wrote to the High Command to report that the Arrow was holding its own in speed and altitude against the best Allied fighters and could carry twice the bomb load of its main rival. Generals who witnessed the early test flights came away enthusiastic. Even the RLM's most doubting voices struggled to argue with the performance data. Yet there was one major problem. The RLM was not primarily an engineering institution. It was a political one. And in the winter of 1943, its politics were dominated by one aircraft above all others, the Messerschmitt Me-262. The Me-262 was a jet where the DO-335 pushed piston engine technology to its absolute limits. The Me-262 seemed to leap beyond them entirely, a glimpse of a future in which propellers were simply obsolete. When Hitler saw it fly at Insterburg in November 1943, just weeks after the DO-335's maiden flight, he was transfixed. Here, he decided, was the wonder weapon that would stop the Allied invasion of Europe. Production of the Me-262 was to be the priority. Everything else was secondary. The Do-335 suffered the consequences immediately. Rather than being given the focused, urgent production program it needed, it was repeatedly redirected. First as a fast bomber, then a multi-role fighter, then a priority program, then deprioritized again in favor of the jets. The RLM couldn't decide what it wanted the era to be, and every change of direction meant more delays, more redesign, more lost time. To make matters worse, on March 18, 1944, American bombers hit Dornier's main production facility at Monsel, destroying the tooling and forcing the entire operation to relocate to Oberpfaffenhofen. It was another major setback at a time when neither Dornier nor Germany could afford one. Yet not all the Do-335's troubles were the result of outside forces. Some came from within the aircraft itself. Pilots soon noticed that the rear engine, buried deep inside the fuselage, cooled by a large intake scoop beneath the belly, tended to run dangerously hot. On April 15, 1944, test pilot Werner Altrogge took one of the prototypes up on an evaluation sortie. Shortly after takeoff, at low altitude, the rear engine caught fire. The blaze burned through the elevator controls. With no ability to pull up, the aircraft plunged vertically into the ground. Witnesses reported that Altrogge appeared to have jettisoned the canopy, the first step in a multi-stage ejection sequence that required blowing off the rear propeller, then the upper tail fin, before the seat could even be armed. The most likely explanation was that the canopy struck him as it tore free, knocking him unconscious before he could complete the sequence. He never made it out of the aircraft. In the wake of the tragedy, Dornier's team scrambled for solutions. The best they could manage was opening the radiator flaps to their maximum position, which brought the temperatures down, but also bled away speed, an uncomfortable trade-off in an aircraft whose primary virtue was velocity. To find a better solution, the engineers would need time. But for Nazi Germany, time was running out. The Allies were growing in strength and confidence by the day. Ironically, after years of stalling development of the Do-335, the German leadership finally decided they needed it, urgently. On May 23, 1944, Hitler issued a directive giving the aircraft maximum priority. Less than 2 weeks later, the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy. Development pressed on regardless. In July, the fourth prototype made its maiden flight, and promptly it suffered a rear engine fire, just as Altrogge's aircraft had 3 months earlier. Luckily for the pilot, this time the onboard extinguisher managed to put out the blaze, saving him from the same fate as his predecessor. Engineers took the aircraft apart to understand why it had happened, adding the findings to a growing body of hard-won knowledge about the aero's most persistent flaw. In September 1944, nearly a year after the first prototype flight, the first pre-production Do-335 finally took to the skies. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, the Air Ministry immediately began demanding more. Not one aircraft, but 5, to be developed simultaneously. A single-seat fighter bomber, a high-speed reconnaissance variant, a 2-seat night fighter, a heavy destroyer, a trainer, each requiring its own modifications, its own tooling, its own production line. The night fighter proposal, the A-6, would carry a radar operator in a raised second cockpit, along with equipment capable of detecting and tracking Allied bombers in total darkness. The B-series destroyer went further still, where the standard Do-335 carried a single 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 smaller guns in the nose. The B-2 added 2 more 30mm cannons in the wings. There were even plans to fit a 55mm weapon in place of the engine-mounted cannon, a gun so powerful that a single hit could catastrophically disable a heavy bomber. Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, the Night Ghost of Saint-Trond, Germany's most prolific night fighter ace with 121 victories to his name, recommended fitting the night fighter variant with upward-firing Schrage Music cannons, angled to rick the belly of a bomber from below. A Do-335 so equipped would have been a nightmare for RAF Bomber Command's crews, who were already dying in their hundreds on every major raid over Germany. However, building 5 versions of an aircraft that hadn't yet entered service, in factories being bombed nightly, with a workforce increasingly composed of forced laborers, was not a production strategy. It was a fantasy. Yet it was one that the RLM appeared entirely unwilling to abandon, even as the Reich collapsed around it. In the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe established Erprobungskommando 335, a small dedicated test unit whose purpose was to develop tactics for the Arrow and prepare it for operational service. It was, in theory, the final step before the Do 335 entered the war. In practice, it was a unit operating in conditions that made meaningful preparation almost impossible. Fuel was scarce. Airfields were being bombed. The pilots assigned to the unit were flying over skies that could no longer be guaranteed free of Allied fighters. And yet the Arrow kept flying. And on the rare occasions Allied pilots caught a glimpse of it, what they saw stopped them cold. In early April 1945, French ace Pierre Clostermann was leading 4 Hawker Tempests, among the fastest piston-engine fighters the Allies possessed, on a sweep over northern Germany, when his formation spotted an unidentified aircraft below them, flying at maximum speed at treetop level. Clostermann gave chase. The German pilot saw them coming and reversed course. 2 of the Tempest pilots managed to open fire, but the unknown aircraft simply pulled away, accelerating into the distance with an ease that made the Tempests seem to be standing still. Clostermann, a pilot experienced enough to know when a pursuit was futile, didn't even attempt to follow. It was a Do 335. The encounter had lasted long enough to confirm one thing. Nothing flying on the Allied side could even dream of keeping up with it. Other sightings were also reported. American Mustang pilots over southern Germany claimed to have spotted one and given chase, with a similar result. The Arrow left them behind without apparent effort. But these were fleeting appearances by an aircraft that existed in tiny numbers, flown by a handful of pilots over a country that was disintegrating beneath them. The war was days from its end, and the men still flying the Arrow knew it. No one understood what it was like to fly the Do 335 in those final days better than Hans Werner Lersch, the Rechlin-based Luftwaffe test pilot who had called the Arrow an aircraft of exceptional flying qualities, and had spoken of the unforgettable, pure pleasure of flying it gave him. Now, in mid-April 1945, with Soviet forces closing in on Rechlin from the east, orders came to evacuate the remaining test aircraft. Lersch, perhaps unsurprisingly, chose the Do 335. Not that there was much else left to fly. Getting airborne proved difficult before he had even left the ground. One Do 335 was destroyed before it could depart. A tire was shredded by bomb fragments on the runway. That left Lersch with a single aircraft. Allied air raids delayed his departure until evening. When he finally took off, he dropped to the lowest altitude he could manage and stayed there, hedge-hopping across the darkening Germany to avoid Allied fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft that had been designed to outrun everything in the sky was reduced to skulking at treetop height. The compass was unreliable. Interference from the rear engine made it almost useless. Lersch navigated by landmarks instead: lakes, railway lines, highways. The engines consumed fuel at a punishing rate, and the transfer pumps that moved fuel between tanks failed during the flight. Every decision had to be made with one eye on the gauge. As darkness fell, he diverted toward Prague, choosing a known airfield over an uncertain journey. Landing brought a new crisis. The undercarriage refused to extend. He worked through the emergency procedures in the dark, knowing that a belly landing in the Do 335 would likely be unsurvivable. The gear finally locked into place. The journey continued via Lechfeld over the following days, through worsening weather, finally landing on April 23rd at Oberpfaffenhofen, Dornier's own factory. The engineers who had built the Arrow watched in surprise as one of their most advanced creations arrived intact. Lersch had crossed a disintegrating country in an aircraft fighting him at every stage. He had made it. 3 days later, with Soviet forces already fighting in the streets of Berlin, one of the remaining prototypes at Rechlin was used to escort a flight carrying General Robert von Greim and aviatrix Hannah Reich to Berlin-Gatow, one of the last aircraft to land in the besieged capital. That same day, another pilot, Heinz Fischer, attempted to fly a Do 335 from Rechlin to Switzerland. His compass failed. He strayed over France, ran out of fuel, and found that both his ejection seat and the tail jettison mechanism had failed. He survived by throwing himself from the aircraft manually, descending by parachute over the Vosges Mountains as Germany burned around him. On April 29th, American forces arrived at the gates of the Oberpfaffenhofen factory and found a scene that was equal parts graveyard and museum. 11 completed Do 335A1 fighter bombers, 2 finished trainers, dozens more in various states of assembly, some nearly complete, some barely begun. all of them waiting for materials and workers that had never arrived. The most advanced piston-engine fighter program in the world, captured intact before it had fired a single shot in anger. The Americans were fascinated. Engineers began examining the airworthy examples with the help of German mechanics, quickly discovering that American aviation fuel and the Daimler-Benz DB602 were not a particularly compatible combination. 2 aircraft were selected for shipment to the United States under a program called Operation Seahorse. Loaded under the Royal Navy carrier HMS Reaper at Cherbourg, alongside a collection of other captured Luftwaffe aircraft, and transported across the Atlantic for detailed evaluation. Before they were even loaded, one of the Do-335s offered a demonstration of its capabilities that nobody had planned. During the ferry flight from Oberpfaffenhofen to Cherbourg, the Arrow easily outclimbed and outdistanced its 2 escorting P-51 Mustangs, arriving 45 minutes ahead of them. The escorts, flying one of the finest fighters of the war, had simply been left behind. In the United States, 1 aircraft went to the Army Air Force at Freeman Field, Indiana. The other was assigned to the U.S. Navy for evaluation at Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland. British test pilot Eric Brown, who flew a captured example for the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, found it, quote, lively to fly, and right from the short takeoff run, under the smooth roar of the 2 Daimler-Benz DB603s, it afforded that comforting feeling of being overpowered, a gratifying sensation that one seldom experiences. Brown would go on to fly 487 different aircraft types, more than any pilot in history. Yet not all the post-war encounters with the Do-335 ended so happily. Both the 2 examples the British acquired came to grief. One suffered a landing accident and was eventually scrapped. The other met a more dramatic end. On January 18, 1946, during a familiarization flight over Hampshire, the rear engine caught fire. The blaze burned through the elevator controls. The aircraft dove vertically into a school building at Cove, costing its pilot his life. It was the same failure mode that had caused the demise of Werner Altroga almost 2 years earlier. The French tested 2 captured examples with similar results. Engine problems, a crash on landing, a hydraulic failure. The Do-335 was, to the end, an aircraft that demanded everything from the people who flew it, and offered no forgiveness for anything that went wrong. Only one survived. The second pre-production aircraft, Werknummer 240102, coded VG plus PH, had been tested by the U.S. Navy, stored at Norfolk for over a decade, donated to the Smithsonian, and was sitting in deteriorating condition in Maryland, when in 1974, it was quietly shipped back to the Oberpfaffenhofen factory where it had been built. The Dornier workers who restored it, many of whom had worked on the original aircraft 30 years earlier, made a discovery that stopped them cold. The explosive charges fitted to blow off the tail fin and rear propeller before ejection were still in the aircraft, armed and live, 3 decades after installation. The Arrow had been waiting all that time to go off. Today, the restored Do-335 hangs in the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia, the National Air and Space Museum's vast annex near Washington Dulles Airport. It sits among other survivors of the Luftwaffe's final years, the only known Arado Air 234 jet bomber, the only surviving Hengel HE-219 night fighter, aircraft that came too late, built by a regime that was already destroying itself. In the end, fewer than 50 Arrows were ever completed. Not one fired its guns in combat. The push-pull configuration that Claude Dornier had spent 30 years fighting to build, the idea that had been cancelled, shelved, redirected, and bombed, survived the war in a handful of airframes, most of which were subsequently crashed, scrapped, or lost. Historian Robert Forsyth, who has written the most detailed study of the aircraft, describes it in 3 words, quote, ambitious, clever, complex. Many would agree with him. Fortunately for the Allies, it never got the chance to prove itself in combat.